Hi, my name is Subhashish. My collaborators, Dr. Mandana Seyfeddinipur, Director of Endangered Languages Archive and Endangered Languages Documentation Program, and Dr. Susan Kang, Archive Manager, Archive of the Endangered Languages of Latin America, and I work together in this session titled Bridging the Divide, Connecting Language Activist Efforts and Language Archives. They both are academics, and I'm a media practitioner and a documentary filmmaker. And I founded OpenSpeaks. It's an open resource for helping citizen documenters and archivists in their efforts of creating multimedia materials in low-resource languages. Our presentation is about how the gaps between language archives and language activists can be addressed. Language documentation, revitalization, reclamation, and activism efforts take place all over the world. At the local, grassroots, community, and international levels, individuals have taken agency and have self-organized to engage in these activities to create a documentary record of their own language, to preserve cultural and linguistic richness and reclaim ownership of and control over their languages and cultures, ensuring data sovereignty. Grassroots level and citizen-led language documentation is largely an informal practice with less funding. Most such efforts have historically stemmed from personal motivation of activists, mostly citizen documenters and archivists who are documenting languages as multimedia content creators, or even by recording word pronunciations as digital lexicographers, or as are small civil society actors. While citizen documenters often lack the training and necessary linguistic and technological skills that trained archivists and linguists have, the former are mostly native speakers or have low entry-level barrier for being trusted by the speakers of the languages documented because of their continued outreach and activism. In academia, linguists have developed theoretical methods for language documentation and have created language archives housed at universities. On the other hand, language activists have created language documentation training materials, organized projects on the Wikimedia ecosystem, formed nonprofits and NGOs, and have used social media platforms for self-organizing and sharing their materials. However, many of these grassroots efforts lack access to stable archives that can help provide long-term digital preservation of these unique and invaluable materials. Simultaneously, language archives based at universities could provide long-term preservation but lack the connection with the activists. It's important to note that the digital transmission of many low-resource languages happen at different levels. Sometimes speakers privately share among each other multimedia language content, either online using social media messenger apps such as WhatsApp or Telegram, or even offline and peer-to-peer content exchanges using technologies like Bluetooth. Legacy technologies such as audio cassettes, CDs, DVDs, or even memory cards also exist. Private and offline language archives maintained directly by communities could provide the highest level of data sovereignty. However, the risk of losing language material to natural calamities or server issues or even lack of resources is very high if the material is only in the possession of a few individuals. Many speakers also use social media to promote their language, audio, video materials online. For those communities, outreach is a priority. Social media platforms offer more convenient and easier reach. However, the design of social media doesn't allow for a structured archive. Some go for entertainment and other media hosting platforms such as YouTube, which are also used by activists. And platforms offering easier dissemination might not have an option for permanent and structured archival storage. We've seen development of new platforms and integration of new tools with existing content platforms. The Lingua Libre project is integrated into the Wikimedia Commons, a sister project of Wikipedia, and it allows anyone to record pronunciations of words in any language or dialect as long as a list of words can be typed. It's beginner-friendly and can be used to create massive online speech records of multiple speakers in a language. The Living Dictionaries project by the Living Tongues Institute helps speakers create dictionary entries one word at a time without having to create large repositories. There exist several language archives and other digital and online repositories that offer access to individuals, collectives, and small institutions for language preservation digitally, and creating materials such as audio, video, text, and other hybrid forms such as digital games and structured data even. Some of the participating archives in the Digital Endangered Languages and Music's Archives Network, DELAMAN, or the Open Language Archives Community, or OLAC networks, include options for archiving materials, linguistic materials. These archives collect and host a considerable amount of metadata in addition to language materials, making the latter more discoverable and reachable. Citizen digital and web-based language documentation and archival practices brings the question of whether or not speakers can trust the internet to further their documentation. Though the internet, through the much-touted multi-stakeholder model, was intended to be a neutral technological solution with no boundaries, it inherited the post-colonial dominance of the developed nation-states, but most importantly, the oligopoly of big tech and major internet corporations. Naturally, citizens are slowly losing ownership of their own personal and community data. Platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Twitter, and WeChat are widely used by content creators around the world. While disseminating content is easier due to simpler and more convenient user experience, content takedown is frequent and rampant, especially in places where authoritarian regimes consistently send platforms content takedown notices. I've cited some links to news about content takedown and account banning in India affecting grassroots journalists and indigenous political activists. India lacks a modern data protection law, and the regulation is based on old and outdated laws. Many indigenous and low-resource language speakers who were already excluded as a community due to majoritarian governance in their own geographical areas are now losing data sovereignty as individuals thanks to the internet. Hence, digital platforms and the internet can be a tool of gross dominance over indigenous and minoritized individuals. In contrast, such platforms can also catalyze language documentation efforts by removing the barriers of cost, professional training, and access to archives. Considering the advantages and disadvantages mentioned in the previous section, we showcase some of the possibilities for building pipelines for long-term collaborations between citizen-led archival and institutional archives. Archives are encouraged to extend localization of their archive interface into at least major dominant languages used as a lingua franca in different places. UN languages are a good starting point. Provide visible documentation on how users can prepare and submit materials and solve potential issues, possibly as FAQs, and ask for help. Keep low entry barriers in all levels, especially for mobile users. To make the archive accessible, some contributors might have only one recording and some might have many. Documentation could also suggest ways to convert files, as different devices produce different file extensions. Include in the documentation in detail, as citizen archivists might not be well trained with language documentation and archiving. For instance, guides on how to use a smartphone for recording, or how to ensure decent lighting and audio quality. And this could be very helpful for them. The uploading form and the overall archival process should be simpler and minimal. This is to allow archivists to, citizen archivists to contribute gradually Instead of preparing annotation and subtitles for a large batch, one should be able to upload one file at a time and do the annotation later. Think of common issues users with low internet bandwidth could face while uploading, as that can help make the uploading process easier. Video file containers such as WebM often help reduce the file size without compromising the quality much. For the citizen archivists, we would encourage to prepare their audiovisual material with a few additional things. First and foremost, archives typically require that all language documentation be collected or created with informed consent from the people being recorded, both to make the recordings in whichever format, including written notes, and to archive the files. It's helpful to map capacity, how many contributors can help you with archiving, their availability and skills, if it's just one person. Secondly, your hardware and software access and skills. Are you using a phone or a camera? Are you using an external mic to record audio? What editing software or other applications you're familiar with, and how you can store the materials. Note that archives do not accept recordings that have added background music unless the recording itself is of music. Capture the material in its raw form and do not add background music or artistic video transitions. Lastly, review the documentation of the archive you plan to upload to. Knowing what an archive accepts or doesn't accept helps you plan well in advance for an upcoming recording session. If you have less capacity, start with archives with low entry barriers, such as the Internet Archives or PAD.MA or the Wikimedia Commons. Or Facebook and YouTube have very low entry barriers for videos, especially in low internet bandwidth cases. However, they could delete materials anytime without discussing or clarifying it to you. Also, except for YouTube, the rest of the platforms that I just shared do not allow hosting data privately. If you plan to keep your data visible to only a limited number of people, then consider other platforms. Wikimedia Commons also mandates open licenses, especially the Creative Commons licenses. Some communities might not want to publish under licenses that allow reuse or derivation or modification of content, which is something that is mandated under the Creative Commons licenses. Internet Archive allows different licenses, and that could be a better alternative in this case. Language archives, on the other hand, mostly have options to choose from when it comes to access and licensing. So those are different options to consider. As archives are for long-term storage of materials, they generally ask for more detailed information for acquisition. But there are also archives such as the Archive of the Indigenous Languages of Latin America or the Language Archive colon that recommend annotation of materials but do not mandate it. You could provide the bare minimum data while uploading if you have limited bandwidth and plan to submit the rest of the data later. Plan the approximate hours or days required for submitting materials. Considering that half of the world's languages are in the verge of extinction within a century, it is critical to bridge the divide between academically based archives and the real world. This is to ensure that all language documentation and archival efforts will be preserved for the long term and will be accessible and available to all the people well in the future. In conclusion, we want to emphasize that institutions that host archives need to create more inclusive pipeline to allow citizen documenters to contribute. Institutional archives must increasingly consider the practical challenges around capacity and other citizen archivists have access to. While their current processes might be best suited for academics, institutional archives should also need to do user testing for their platforms for citizen archivists that have less capacity and resources. On the other hand, Citizen documenters and archivists must be informed regularly about the offerings of the language archives managed by linguists and other media hosting platforms such as the Internet Archive or Wikimedia Commons, and why long-term archival strategies are needed sooner than later. That way, grassroots activists and collectives can make informed decisions and reallocate time. I've also included some further reading and our contact at the end of this presentation. We look forward to your questions and input. Thank you all.